Hello and welcome to The Chase. I'm Ibn Mabunda. Let's get started. In about 6 months' time, the Republic of Zimbabwe heads for its harmonized elections. Crucial to the polls will be the race for the presidential post to determine who will lead Zimbabwe over the next 5 years. Question is, will Zimbabwe have a second Robert in the position of a president? To discuss that, I'm joined by Robert Chapman, the presidential candidate for the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe. Mr. Chapman, hello and welcome to The Chase.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Fantastic. To get the ball rolling, who is Robert Chapman?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak with The Chase. I watch your program very much, and so I am very glad to be here. Robert Chapman, I am Zimbabwean, I am Christian, I am a father, a husband, an entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and just a human being. So I think this is about as easy as I can note it.
Right. Your profile says that you are a former vice president of a multi-million-dollar establishment, as well as a pilot. Question would be, why leave that flourishing career to get your hands dirty in what appears to be a polarized political system here in Zimbabwe?
Great question. No question about it that I've lived a very comfortable life outside Zimbabwe, and I've built a life for myself and my family. But as often I would come back to Zimbabwe, I'd see that things were not getting better. And then more and more I got engaged with the people on the ground, and more I got engaged with my citizens, my friends, my colleagues, my family. I really got to see that we needed some real change that needed to come through. I think that hope had been lost. A lot of people had looked forward, whether we started from 2008, and we went through to the elections of 2018, and where we're going now, really started to see that things were becoming extremely polarized. And I felt very compelled to see how I could help my country grow. You know, could I use my expertise, or could I use my experience in the way that I grew up in my childhood, and then looking at the successes that I've been able to be blessed with, how can I bring those back in the skill set back to Zimbabwe and build our country? So for me, it really, I felt very called to this mission. I felt very called to come back home and see how I can engage. Initially, I was engaged from a distance, where I would come in, or help somewhere, or be a well-wisher, someone to reach out. But this time I decided to get off the bench and get in and see how we can make sure that either we change the conversation in our country, or really start to deliver real change in our country.
Now, recently, you were quoted for having said that people were too comfortable in certain positions and they started looking out for themselves instead of the country. And it's on both sides of the aisle. Now, many believe it was directed toward fellow opposition players. Would you want to bring clarity where that is actually concerned?
Yes, absolutely. And I genuinely believe that people have become very comfortable inside their positions of government. And this is to everyone. And so for opposition to come out and say, well, the labeling is there, that is directly towards us, three quarters of the parliament is the ruling party, ZANU-PF. So it includes them as well. They're a majority of that aspect. What I looked at wasn't the individuals. We started looking at were we progressing as a country, and were policies that were going through really benefiting the people. So if we started to look and say, let's do a lifestyle audit of individuals that are in parliament, whether they're in ruling party or they're in opposition or any opposition, we really got to see that if we do a lifestyle audit versus the development of the country, there's a huge disparity. So it was obvious that the elected individuals that were elected by their communities, elected by their citizens, were not really representing them well, because there's not really much development taking place in the country. Even if we broke it down to some of the minuscule communities at a council level and at a constituency level, we're not really seeing that development taking place. But we're seeing, folks are enjoying the luxury of cars, houses, and illicit loans that really should be benefiting the people of the country. So I genuinely believe that it's on both sides of the aisle, unfortunately.
So by that assertion, you believe that the political players that have seen playing have actually perhaps lost track of the real goal and diverted onto some personal interests. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I certainly believe that. If we just travel the country, it's very evident. It's no longer a question of whether we understand or not. Information is now available at a very fast pace. In 5 minutes, we will know something's happening in one part of the country. In another 10 minutes, something's happening in another part of the country. But it doesn't seem to really be moving or changing is poverty, is the level of poverty in this country. The fact that our youth don't have jobs. We're not seeing the formation of new companies, but we're seeing politicians really, their lives excelling inside politics while the country itself is not. And so that's where we have a real big challenge there.
Now, I read somewhere where you said you look at government from a private sector perspective. Would you want to bring clarity on this and perhaps what you actually meant with that?
No, great one. Yeah, so what I meant from that is when I originally started looking at how do I engage in the country and how do we start making progress here, the very first place I started from was private sector, because that's an area that I was very familiar with, very comfortable with, engaging in conversations. I was very comfortable in being able to network, so to speak, and get to either to the right seats and talk to people. So when I looked at private sector and saying, one is how can we develop in the country, I started to realize we had a real challenge when it came to whether it was policy, whether it was the access, or they called the ease of business in the country, and then the relationship regionally or internationally. There was a real big challenge here. So as I started communicating with colleagues that understood the landscape a little bit better, say from the political side of things, the question came up is how do we fix this? And the answer was we have to fix politics. The politics in the country have to be better for the private sector to really thrive. And so we started looking at that. So when I think of private sector and government, there is a fine line in where they really have to merge. Everything from our economic policy to our taxation, the way that we create jobs and the way that we create industrialization in our country, there has to be a direct correlation between what government is doing and what policies are going through and what private sector is seeing globally on the market, on the world market and the world stage, and making sure that Zimbabwe stays ahead of the curve. We are not really seeing that. And in fact, what we're seeing is a decline in formal sector or industrialization in this country consistently. I was just at the CZI symposium, and that was the most common challenge that a lot of the business, some of the largest employers in this country really stressed was the formal sector is now sort of pigeonholed, where they're now sort of, at the minority of the economic structure. The informal sector now carries 80% is holding 80% of the country's economy together, not the formal sector. So when we look at that imbalance, we realize that from a private sector perspective, we need to support the investors. We need to have policy that makes sense, and we need to make sure that there's a tax code that allows companies to thrive and continue to add more employees, and they continue to grow and become relevant on the global market space.
I will actually engage in conversation a bit further in this discussion in as far as economic policy is concerned. Let's look at the fact that Nkosana Moyo, who got 0.32% of the 2018 presidential election vote, has endorsed you for presidency. How much of an impact will this support be to you as a presidential candidate as well as for your party?
That's a great question as well, and I have tremendous respect for Dr. Nkosana Moyo. When he and his party came out and said they were supporting Robert Chapman, I believe it was the day after the press conference, December 10 or December 11, when they came out and supported us, for us, I was extremely grateful. And the reason I was extremely grateful is because this is someone that is respected in Zimbabwe. Regardless of the result of the election, when people look at Dr. Nkosana Moyo, they know for a fact that this is a respectable individual. This is an individual that has accomplished huge, tremendous success. And so to have his endorsement for me was very heartfelt, and I was very thankful for that because it allowed people to engage in conversation on who is Robert Chapman, who is DUZ. So to have someone of his stature come and say, no, we are endorsing this candidate. We believe that this candidate has the experience and has the global view to see how Zimbabwe can come forward on an economic standpoint. I was very, very thankful.
Right, a respectable gentleman, I believe he is, but he attained 0.32% of the electoral result in 2018. But that is it may. There are some assertions or claims that say that you perhaps are Nkosana 2.0. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think labeling in the country is a very common thing that we do these days, and sometimes it's used as a way to try and shun a new player in the field and keep the same old guard or same old players in. I don't know the strategy that APA used in 2018. I was not part of that structure back then. I don't know what methods they really went through. What I did is I really looked at the individual of Dr. Nkosana Moyo And I've said this multiple times, that I believe that if we looked at substance in our political candidates, and we look at how we've chosen candidates over the last several elections, Zimbabwe has really missed the opportunity to be led by people that really have experience and can take the country forward. We've really missed out, including Dr. Nkosana Moyo. So regardless of the result that he attained in 2018, for me, I was very, very proud and very excited to see that someone actually who had merit, who had credentials, who loved his country, stepped up and said, you know what, I'm not just going to sit on the sidelines. Let me get in here and engage in the conversation. And here we are in 2023 talking about him. So I'd like to think that he's left his mark in the political landscape and has passed the torch on, which I hope to do that as well for future generations. When other Zimbabweans look and they say, you know, here's an orphan or here's someone that started from nothing, but is really feel that they've got called to try and help their country progress, that they know that they can step up and face the heat and come into the game and change the country.
Just to jump in there, credentials, you said, and you also indicated that you believe that Zimbabwe missed an opportunity to get the right people with the necessary credentials to actually take Zimbabwe forward. Are you suggesting that perhaps the players that we're seeing in both perhaps the CCC as well as the ZANU-PF are not perhaps well qualified and perhaps do not have the necessary credentials to actually take the country forward?
Yeah, I genuinely believe that. I'll answer that very straightforward. I don't think they do. The results are evident. If we look at performance, and in this case we can only really pay attention to ZANU-PF because they've been the government for quite a long period of time. But even if we go back to, say, the GNU timeframe where both parties were in, we can look at the quality of decisions and the performance that took place and really look back and say, maybe these people didn't understand the global perspective. So even today when we start articulating programs or what opposition parties are presenting, because all they can do is present what they're going to give the people. When it comes to the ruling party, we have to evaluate what they have done or not done, which is a little bit different from opposition. In opposition, what we're doing is saying, we're going to make a promise, we're going to make a commitment to development. When we look at what those issues are, it's very evident that they don't really have a global perspective of how those things should be done, how they can be articulated, and how long is the time frame to get such either a project or a policy in place. So it's very, very clear that they're very limited in their expertise.
Just to jump in there, you just made reference to the GNU.
Yes.
Question is, would you want to be part of a GNU?
You know, I'm seeing that the polls are showing that Zimbabweans would favor that. I think the most recent one we saw, whether we agree with it or not, is showing that Zimbabweans were open to looking at a government of national unity. So if the Zimbabwean people are pushing that narrative and saying that we want to see something like this, then yes, we would respect that.
Okay, so the answer would be yes.
Yes.
All right. Critics say that you're coming up to form another party when you could have the option of perhaps joining another opposition party, so for example, the CCC. And there are also, perhaps you mentioned labeling earlier, there are some critics who also say perhaps you are a part of a plot to split the vote across the country. How do you respond to that?
You know, we've seen that and we've decided not to respond, or we've responded sort of at a top level and not really taking that deeply. One is the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe has its own constitution, has its own ideology and its own code of conduct. We have our own framework of what we look like and who we are. The labeling of saying that we are an outfit set to split votes is just hogwash. It's just not true. And we've seen this over and over and over. It's almost exhausting. It's a song that continues just to be on repeat. And it has never taken any opposition anywhere. We see the same labeling from the other side. If you disagree with ZANU-PF or the ruling party, they'll call you a Western puppet. You know, so for us, we sensed that the moment we launched, there were people that wouldn't be happy with us coming out and creating our own party, and we knew that our first battle was going to be opposition. We knew they were the first ones, even though they preached democracy, we knew that they would be the first to attack us. So we intentionally said we're not going to respond because they're not where the real battle is for us is going to be. We see it online where they come out and they'll use tactics and say, oh, you're ZANU-PF and try to create the narrative. For us coming out as a new party, it should be something that should be celebrated in the democratic landscape of Zimbabwe. Whether we agree or disagree, whether it's on free and fair elections or not, we understand that the political climate in our country is extremely polarized and very toxic. So when we created our party, we came out in a position that said, we are coming out because they're coming out to create an opportunity for people to have another alternative. It's not just two players. The same two players we've seen over and over and over and over where nothing has changed. So the question I would put to citizens is, I don't think the question is, should a new party come in? The question is, the people that have been around for so long, have they delivered anything for you? And if they haven't, maybe you should be looking at a third alternative. The polls and the numbers show us, and data, which is unemotional, shows us that there is a bigger group of people that no longer subscribe to either side, that the faith in the political system has completely deteriorated. And for us coming in, and we're seeing this on the ground in large numbers.
And you believe that you are their Messiah?
I wouldn't say Messiah, absolutely not. I'm a human being. So I'm not their Messiah, I'm not their rescuer, I'm not their savior, but we are a choice. We are an option for them to take a look at. My goal is to come in as a civil servant, to serve the country, and eventually exit and go back to private sector or retire with my family. I'm still a young man. So if I can commit 10 years or 12 years to this country wholeheartedly and exit, or let me say 5 years, successfully demonstrate that we can take the country forward, become re-elected, and the party allows me to become the candidate, we serve a total of 10 years, and then go back and spend time with my son, with my family, with my children. So we don't see that right now. We have people that want to rule, not people that want to build. We need to take our country forward, and we need to start building our country, and we need to build our people, and we get away from polarization and toxic politics.
Now, let's explore this choice. Does the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe actually have structures? And along with that, how come you are more known than the party itself?
Great question. We do have structures, and we've been around the country. I think the numbers show that there's entities taking place. If anyone is really sort of paying attention to our meetings, we actually introduce them before every single meeting. We actually introduce the structures. So in Bulawayo, we introduced provincial structures, district structures. They're all there. And so we have people that are on the ground, that are mobilizing, that are working within the DUZ framework, Democratic Union of Zimbabwe's framework. So we do have those structures in place. The question you ask now is on popularity. People seem to know you more. And the reason we did is a strategic brand. So our marketing team, and we looked at data and said we need to elevate the presidential candidate. Unfortunately, our politics is politics of popularity. So one of the things we want to do is get in front and say, let's highlight the presidential candidate. We do have a launch, and our Constitution allows us mandates that we also have Congress. At that point, we'll see the bigger picture of the organization.
You speak of Congress. A question would be, how many people do you actually have under your party? Registered members, that is, and perhaps also that would form part of your leadership structure.
I can't answer that because answering that would be getting ahead of the party and ahead of myself. We want to demonstrate that strength. I can tell you right now, our website membership is extremely high. Our membership on the ground is extremely high. Again, as I mentioned, if you're just looking at the numbers from the meetings that we're having around the country, you can clearly see just in attendance, not those even from a supportive standpoint, just in attendance, the numbers are very high for a party that is about two months old or announced itself 2 months ago. You can tell that there is momentum on the ground. So online, we've had a huge influx of people registering on our website, particularly right after the press conference, which was very shocking, to be honest. We didn't expect the numbers to go the way that they did just from an announcement. But we suspected that opportunity was there because the polls had shown us, data had proved to us, there was a larger group of people waiting for another alternative.
Why the question of numbers would be important is because your counterparts, ZANU-PF as well as the CCC, they have card-carrying members who pay subscriptions.
Correct.
And that contributes toward their funding to some extent. Mm-hmm. So the question will still be, how many members do you have and how are you going about your funding?
All right. So on the funding side, a lot of our, go ahead. Sure. On the funding side, I have been funding the party personally. We've had some contributors that have come from members that have come in and registered. Our website allows people to contribute to the party, and they've contributed. Of course, if someone's registering, they're typically Zimbabwean. They're registering, but they can contribute through our website with no problem at all, anywhere from $10 to whatever they feel comfortable doing. So we have those subscriptions as well that are people that have memberships where they're contributing to the party. But so far, I have been personally funding the party myself, which has been very expensive, if I'm being honest.
And how much have you spent so far?
Oh, I'm not going to answer that question. But I can tell you that it is a tough conversation in our household to have.
perhaps that question would come in the bracket of transparency, so that perhaps the people that you're looking to get on board can have an appreciation of the agenda and the mantra that you're running with. So how much?
Oh, I'm not going to answer that question. I'll just tell you straightforward, I'm not going to answer that question.
Right. Let's move on to another subject, the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe. What went into the framing as well as the naming of the particular organization?
You know, that was an interesting time frame. We started that process right around the end of 2019 into 2020. COVID sort of slowed us down in early 2020. We revisited the conversation, and I say we, myself, and some colleagues that understood the political landscape of Zimbabwe. And we said, you know, how do we put this together? What framework do we create? And so the first thing they said is you need to create a constitution. People need to know how to join you. They need to understand that there is, I believe in institutions, powerful institutions, more than individuals. So the institution needed to outlast the members that were in there, which is something that I look forward to, DUZ, continually moving through elections and growing as a relevant political entity in this country. And so we looked at that and said, what is the framework we need to put in place? So we started our constitution, we looked at our ideology and our code of conduct. How do we carry ourselves in public? How do we carry ourselves as professionals? And making sure that we always remain true to being a political party that pushes a political agenda. And we don't really cross the line sort of into activism. We wanted to be very careful about that and say, no, we are pushing a political agenda to move the country forward. So we started that process in 2021. Our constitution is older than the newest opposition, or the newer opposition party. We've had that constitution for quite some time. And so we had some bright minds to help us put that together, and then we can start to continue building the framework on the ground before the announcement that we were going to enter the 2023 elections. But that was our intent right from the get-go.
Now, ahead of the elections, you mentioned the fact that you had a constitution well in advance, indicating some degree of preparedness. Question would be, will the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe field candidates across all the constituencies in the country?
Yes, we will. That's probably as easy as I said. Yes, we will. We're fielding 100% candidates throughout the country. And so, you know, we look at what's happening now, the delimitation report. While there's chaos in that as well, and we're analyzing that very, very quickly, for us, we are looking at it from a opportunity standpoint, because you know, whether the lines are redrawn, we're not directly affected by that. Although we know there is some mechanisms put in place where some areas are going to be split and some are being joined into one, but create double candidates. For DUZ, we've really made sure that we're paying attention to that report, but we're looking at it from an opportunity perspective and making sure that we're safeguarding against any other gerrymandering that might be taking place. So. Yes, we will be fielding 100% candidates.
Right. And as a presidential candidate, what percentage of votes do you see yourself garnering?
Well, we're shooting for the win. So right now, the target for us is about 74%. 74% of the votes is what we're targeting. We know that there is a larger center.
And that's for the presidential?
That's for the presidential. We're shooting for that, and that's our goal that we're striving for. And so we look at the center, we know what the polls and the numbers are showing us in the middle, and then we want to take a little bit from each side, from each of the extreme spectrums. We think that we can win people on both sides of strongholds of parties.
And you sound very optimistic. What strategies have you in place to see to that goal is actually achieved?
For us, it's staying away from toxicity. You know, people are tired of the toxic politics. They're tired of the journey of politics that takes place. What people are looking for now, which is very evident, is they're looking for real solutions. They're looking for real leaders that can really implement solutions in the country. The idea that we're continually complaining or creating excuses, which is what happens today. If you ask for something very simple development in, say, in a town or in a city, you will see both entities pointing at each other, and no one actually takes responsibility. And for us, we're coming in saying, listen, we know and understand how to solve these problems, and we're going to demonstrate to you that we can solve these problems. And we go through with a very clear policy, a very simple strategy, and we're focused on three very strong pillars. One is prosperity, which is very personal to people, and it also means that the country needs to be able to put in strict policy in place to make sure that people are prosperous, and companies and organizations are prosperous in this country, and make sure it's moving forward. A justice system that works. The social fabric and trust between government and citizen is completely deteriorated at this point, that people don't trust the government anymore, whichever way you look at it. And for us, we're coming in with a very different conversation around how we're looking at the judicial policy and process in this country. And then number three is modernization. Right now, you know, I woke up this morning, no power. Thank God there's a backup system. But if we can, when we're looking at modernization, one, we're looking at policy, and two, we're looking at infrastructure. You can't discuss economic development without addressing some of the basic things such as energy shortage. So for us, having that message as we move through and engaging people and showing them that, no, we have a process in which we're going to execute on this, and we're going to make sure that we have the right people executing your communities, we believe that people really welcome our message, and it looks like it's being received extremely well.
Right. As if to digress a little bit, Zimbabwe's relations with the West have soured perhaps over the past 2 decades or so. Now, considering your ties with the West by reason of your family actually being based there, what are you doing to position yourself for acceptance back home?
I think the acceptance is there already because I am Zimbabwean. I think anywhere we go around the world, Zimbabweans are generally loving people. When it's interesting here on the ground in the country, a lot of Zimbabweans always walk around with the political jacket on and not a national identity or national pride. When you leave the country, I'll give an example. I remember I was in a shopping mall, I think I was in Atlanta, Georgia, and there was an event taking place, and I was in a store in the shopping mall, and I heard two guys speaking. And I just said, and there was Zimbabwean, of course, they were speaking Shona, and I said to him, "How kundipim dada?" And they just loved it. They never asked me what political party I belonged to. They didn't ask me. All they asked is, where are you from? Where'd you grow up? Oh, I'm so happy to meet another Zimbabwean. And so, so the acceptance is already there. I think my story is very telling. I was raised in a location. I was raised very poor upbringing. And so people really relate with that. And they realize when they meet me or I'm interacting with them that I genuinely want the country to succeed beyond political jackets or any other religious jackets or any, genders and all these things. We want our country to move forward. So that has been received extremely, extremely well. I have not really faced anyone that has come up against me except for folks that think that they should be the only ones that should be able to participate in a political dialogue. Outside of that, the ground has been extremely warm and extremely welcoming. The relationship with the West you bring up is a very important one. And it's not just the West. We have to have a relationship even regionally and continentally here. One of the things we're not looking at very closely is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement as a way to build our economy very, very quickly. And so the opportunity for me, because of my experience in the West, I would understand very quickly how to navigate those parameters and those circles to build the country forward and to ensure that we start to remove certain measures that are in place that are hindering us from succeeding. But the first thing we need to do is really introspect and ask ourselves, our laws and our policies and the way we're executing against those, supporting citizens in Zimbabwe to progress first before we try to make another entity progress that's outside our borders or outside our walls. So I would start with our country, move to the regional bloc, look continentally, and then if the West doesn't want to play with us, then we play with who wants to play with us, and we make sure that the country moves forward. But above all, Zimbabweans come first. The country comes first, and at some point we have to build and get away from the politics and start to build the country. Then we come back to the next election cycle, and we can do politics all over again.
Well, time to take a breather. When we come back, we explore other issues of interest and as far as the 2023 harmonized elections are concerned. The Chase will be right back. Don't go anywhere.
Welcome to it. If you're just joining us, you're still tuned into the weekend setup, and you know what happens here. We give you nothing but the hottest stuff.
Tell me more.
Come to the comment section. That is heavy responsibility.
In Zimbabwe.
Right now, it's happening, yeah.
Enjoy the convenience and security of the refreshed AFC Internet Banking platform. This time check is brought to you by AFC Commercial Bank.
Welcome back. This is The Chase, and we are running with an election series. I'm in conversation today with Robert Chapman, the presidential candidate for the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe, and we pick up conversation around what it is that can be expected ahead of the 2023 elections. Mr. Chapman, before we took the break, you mentioned some folks that were anti in as far as the mission of the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe is actually concerned. One of them would be independent legislator Themba Mliswa, who has called you a clown for not having any political history and yet having such a lofty ambition. His diction may be a little bit harsh. What's your take on that? And do you think that perhaps you are the next Donald Trump of Zimbabwe?
Oh, wow, Donald Trump. No, I would not be the next Donald Trump of Zimbabwe. For me, I think, social media is an interesting place. You know, a lot of people can say what they want to say and they have the freedom to say so. So I never responded to Themba Mliswa's comment. And nor will I engage in that. I think it's sort of shallow, to be honest. For us, for myself, I looked at the opportunity that presented in Zimbabwe. And again, we looked at data, unemotional. Comments like that are very emotional, so we looked at things that are very unemotional. What is the decision capacity? What are we using to make good decisions? And for us, it's going to be data. And then we have people on the ground that are speaking to us, which we mentioned before. We've got folks in every province, every constituency, every ward, and every district. And so we're feeling the ground and saying, are people really looking for change? Does the ground support the data? And the answer is yes, it does, which is why the results that we're seeing astronomically high. The turnout is much, much greater than would have maybe originally anticipated. So for us, I wouldn't say I'm the next Donald Trump. No, I'm just a citizen that is tired of seeing things the way that they are. The country's not progressing. Politics is now a politics of wealth. You get into politics for wealth, not because of development or build. And we want to change that. People already know this. They just didn't have anywhere else to turn. And we have created that avenue and that opportunity for them to look at DUZ as an option for them in 2023. Is that a lofty goal? Absolutely. Being a head of state of any country is a very lofty goal, and it comes with a lot of responsibility. And I believe that my team, myself, and my family are very prepared to take on that responsibility.
You dismissed his comments as being petty, and yet there would be a premise where he says that you perhaps do not have as much experience where the political terrain is actually concerned. How would you respond to that?
Well, you may be correct that politically I've not served in sort of any public office, but I don't think that is a prerequisite for the job. The prerequisite for the job is, can you sell your message and give the citizens hope that they would vote for you and believe that you bring change to the country. Understanding our political landscape here in this country, if that's what he's referring to, which is extremely complex, considering since independence, we've only had really 2 presidents in this country. And one has sort of violated the Constitution, and the other one was removed via a coup, not coup. Being able to bring that to fruition, saying that there's no experience there, I think would be a little bit naive for them to think that I would just enter that space without having enough advisors to help direct and put measures in place to know where we're going. I've been part of successful organizations that understand that in some cases you can bring an outsider in that really makes an organization change very quickly, and because their perspective is very, very different from those that are inside. I think it's being able to see the trees through the forest type quotation. And so for me, it's making sure that I surround myself with the right people that are able to guide us. It'll be the same requirement as making sure that I surround myself with people in government to make sure that the country continually progresses. Even when we go in at the presidential level, at the executive level, you're surrounded by advisors and you're surrounded by a cabinet that has expertise in various areas that continually advise you on the right decision. And that's the same way that we will travel, we're moving with our political party. I'm not making 100% of the decisions. I seek counsel, I seek advice, and in some cases traditional advice, and in some cases it's modern advice. But the expertise saying that I've not served before, I think is a plus, not a negative.
To respond to that, you come in with some degree of corporate exposure. Your profile says that you have been a vice president of some multi-million-dollar establishment. With that, you would appreciate that there is some kind of a corporate ladder that one has to go up. and you are coming into Zimbabwe and they're shooting right for the executive without perhaps engaging perhaps at a council level, at House of Assembly level, and shooting straight for the stars. How do you respond to that?
I think it's be the same answer I just gave you a moment ago. You know, if you're looking at, let's use the same corporate example you're asking.
Right.
You can move up a ladder when it comes to experience, but you don't. If you're an executive at one company, if you're making a transition to another industry, you don't go back and start at the bottom of that ladder, because your experience, the principal competency, the competencies that are required of performance, principles would sort of remain the same. And what you do is essentially just learn the process of that company or the culture of that company is what you'd learn. So coming from corporate governance, if we had an electronic company today and we recruited a CEO who had shown tremendous success from manufacturing, and we brought them over, they would bring a certain level of skills, which is from organizational skills, which we've demonstrated in DUZ that we are organized. There's a competency level of being able to mobilize quickly and being able to use platforms and technology in place to bridge the gap when it comes to time and money. And so many other entities that come there shows experience that someone might have a different entity, a different experience level.
But that's pretty much experience in as far as the corporate world is concerned. I'm not too sure where the field of politics is actually concerned. Perhaps that's what Themba Mliswa is referring to.
Maybe so, but as I mentioned, it's not a prerequisite that's required. The Constitution doesn't say that I need to be an MP to be able to run for public office, to run for the highest office in the land, which is why I said there's a level of experience that I would bring to Zimbabwe that people that might be even MPs, because if we're saying that let's look at competency level of people that have been in politics, then we should look at their performance when they were in politics. Did they perform at that level? And if they didn't, then maybe they shouldn't run. Right? So if we're saying we're looking at competency level, just because you held a position doesn't necessarily mean that you're competent enough to hold that. So what we have to look is we have to look at the entire conversation of this entity that is presenting its presidential candidate. What are they bringing to the table, and do we believe that they can deliver the change that is needed? Which is why I go back to saying, from a corporate perspective, and we're looking and saying, this is someone that has been part of large organizations and has built things and has contacts. If we needed to build this country forward, this is someone that might have the ability to navigate those waters a little bit different from someone that might have come in and maybe failed at a different level.
Moving ahead, let's talk about how that in certain areas of the country you have lower levels of registration as compared to others. How are you, as the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe, actually encouraging the populace to actually register ahead of the elections?
You know, that's a tough one, because you know, a lot of people have voter apathy now. They don't really think anything's going to change, and that's been one of the bigger conversations we're having with citizens, is really helping them understand what 5 years means. And I think a lot of people have sort of said nothing's going to change. It's the same players. We keep getting the same promises, but we don't see anything changing. So for us, when we go into, whether it's in rural areas and mobilization, we really encourage them to understand the impact, not maybe in cases for the elderly, not just for them, but for their family and the young folks that are coming up in their families. 5 years is a long time to ignore the ability to register to vote, to not participate in the voting process. And so what we're doing is we're really having that conversation with people at a very, very personal level. And again, our ground team, our folks on the ground and our coordinators are really pushing that message extremely well. What we're calling on citizens, now that we know the new borders and the new lines that have been drawn through the delimitation process, is making sure that they now understand where their polling stations are, and making sure that they now have personal responsibility in that process, and we're moving that conversation forward. So it's a tough one, to be honest. A lot of people have really given up and said, hey, I'm not going to participate, and we're really changing that, and we're seeing the results. Again, as I mentioned, a lot of people are really have welcomed our message very, very well.
Now, the Zimbabwe Council of Churches was among signatories which called for an election sabbatical lasting a period of 7 years. Now, the proposal read, the churches said the Sabbath was a deep theological theme based on God's command to his people to set the seventh day for a rest. And there's a quotation that says 7 years were also considered as Sabbath years. 7 years Sabbaths, or 49 years, constituted what was called the Jubilee season. And they claim that in this Jubilee season, the land would be left fallow so that it could recover its nutrients. Debts would be forgiven, new relationships would be built, and God would bless his people, they claim. Now, Zimbabwe reaches her jubilee year in 2029. The nation could use this coming period to usher in a true jubilee for the nation by removing all political contestation. You said earlier that you were a Christian. What's your response to this particular proposal?
You know, it's I wouldn't say that I have much of a deep response to it. They have put their proposal forward, but you know, Zimbabwe has a constitution, and it has a constitution that it would need to follow that constitution. It comes back to the will of the people. Our country is very diverse, and while the Council of Churches have put their recommendation forward, the Zimbabwean people go beyond that. Some may not believe what I believe, and this is why the Constitution is important and is really something that we should adhere to. So. As simple as I can respond to it, they have the right and the freedom to present their thoughts and their visions to it. But as a country, we've got to follow the Constitution. And if the Constitution mandates that every 5 years we have an election, then we have to have that electoral process. What we need to make sure is that people that are in positions of power or positions of legislative power need to ensure that they're not waiting for the 11th hour to start looking at complaints around processes around free and fair elections. These are processes that should start implementing in place, whether they're reforms, putting in place or so that we can have free and fair elections in the next election. But I can't answer on behalf of the Council of Churches. For me, I would like to believe that if we're looking at what's best for Zimbabwe, we need to follow our Constitution.
What's your position on the PVO bill, the private voluntary organizations bill that is in the pipeline?
Yeah, that one is a tricky one. I didn't agree with it, and I was surprised that it passed through Parliament as easy as it did. You know, there are many organizations that have helped a lot of people in this country. There are many volunteer organizations that serve a big purpose in this country, particularly with the way we look at our economy. So I think that it was disguised in a way that made it look like something it wasn't. But I was really against not really a fan of the PVO bill, and I was surprised that it went through Parliament in the way that it did, if I'm being honest, which is why I keep going back to Parliament and saying that there are people that are there. Some of them don't even attend the sessions. They don't live in their constituencies. They're not really, connected to the ground, which is very unfortunate. That some people are going to lose some benefits, and some organizations are going to, unfortunately, not be able to serve people in certain places because of this PVO bill. The question is the government going to bridge the gap? I highly doubt that. So I was not a big fan of the PVO bill.
Would you have an alternative, perhaps, to the bill?
I wouldn't have an alternative. I think that we would need to have an engagement that would come in and take a look at why would we want to put something like this in place right now. What is the threat that we're saying that this bill needs to go through to ensure that is there another mechanism that doesn't affect people losing access to certain aid or certain care? I think that's the conversation we should be having. If it's an issue of national security, then we should have a national security conversation. If it's an issue of abuse in organizations that are supposed to be taking care of people, then let's have that conversation. But putting a blanket across the entire country, I think, was very unfortunate.
Now, Zimbabwe has been under international isolation for over 2 decades. This has resulted in limited access to credit lines, and the effects of that are there perhaps for all to see. Question is, what is the position of the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe to get the country out of this abyss?
You know, the first thing we need to do, and you're correct that there has been some isolation, but at some point, the optics is important. So we have to look at what have we done to cause that isolation. In some case, we have created that isolation ourselves. And in some other areas, we've not been competitive or have not become attractive to people or entities or other organizations. So they're working with other countries instead of us. And so what we're left on our own. We have to come back and revisit our policy. We have to revisit the way that we're carrying ourselves as a country in the international community. Are we attractive for international dialogue? Are we attractive to regional dialogue here? Are we really making sure that our citizens are coming first or being taken care of? And if the answer is no to those things, then of course people will say it might be a little bit tricky for us to engage with you because it'll also affect our image on the international stage. And so for us, we have to really introspect and look internally and say, are we doing the things that are necessary to build Zimbabwe and Zimbabweans forward? And if the answer is yes, then we need to start creating, our own mechanisms and branding that allows people to find themselves attractive to us, which that branding comes in forms of policy, comes in forms of tax code, comes in form of judicial process, when it comes to protections of foreign direct investment, it comes to human rights protections. We have to follow our Constitution. Otherwise, people generally can't see themselves doing business with us or engaging with us. The global market is shifting at a very fast pace.
There, by that, are you supporting this isolation?
No, I'm not supporting it at all, the isolation. But we have to introspect. We have to be honest with ourselves. The first step in solving any problem is admitting you have one. And so the admission that I'm saying is we have to admit that some of the things that have caused the isolation we own. We can't help if someone says, hey, we're going to isolate you, we can't go and advocate and cry and say we want you to engage with us. What we have to ask is why would someone isolate with us? And if we said, no, we've done all the things right, and someone still wants to isolate with us, then we say that's fine. But if we're not doing the right things internally for our country and for our people, we can't then blame the international community not engaging with us, because we own that responsibility ourselves, which is why we come back to the idea that are we following our Constitution? Are we taking care of our citizens? Are we fighting corruption? Do we have human rights? Are we adhering to the international human rights policies that are there? And if the answer is yes on all these fronts, then we have to come back and say, okay, to the international community, why are you not engaging with us? So no, we don't need isolation. If we're going to grow as a country, we have to be part of the global market and part of the international community. We have to. What we have to make sure is, while we are making the adjustments, we don't lose our identity as Zimbabweans as we go through this process. We're not becoming something someone else wants us to be. So we have to remain true to ourselves and making sure that we're also engaging the international community.
In the name of being true to ourselves, one of the key issues or sticking issues with regards to the international isolation would, of course, be that to do with the repossession of land and the land redistribution program, which is undertaken by the government of Zimbabwe. Where does the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe stand where that is concerned? And was Zimbabwe wrong to reclaim land?
I don't know that I would say it was right or wrong. I think the method in which it took place and how it transpired, I think would have been, was probably a little bit violent. Well, not a little bit, it was violent. It was a violent process, which was extremely unfortunate for our country to go through at that time. I think if we now reflect on that, looking back in history, and we come forward to where we are today, I know that the government of the day is working on a package, I believe, or they've agreed to a package to recompensate some of the farmers. For me, and I've been asked this question before, we would need to put a commission in place and come back and say, where are we today based on the history we've learned before? But this a big part of that is, how do we create peace and reconciliation in our country so the country can move forward from that event, right? And that event meaning both domestically and internationally. How do we move forward, and what is the right method to do that? And it would really have consultation of all parties involved, including, it means the farmers themselves, the country's own leaders and elderly, and making sure that we come to a point of peace and reconciliation. Then we need to look at the allocation of land. When we went through that process, what transpired that land? Is that land producing outputs for the country? And if it's not, we need to revisit that and understand what process do we put in place for that as the country begins to move forward.
You call for some kind of a retrospection into what transpired. Mm-hmm. How would you perhaps have preferred this very process to have been carried out, if at all?
I don't know that I would have an answer for that. I was young at the time, as a young man. Looking back on the country, I think it's created a huge division. I think that we are still paying a heavy price for that to this very day.
That's the consequence.
Correct.
Your preference?
Yeah, I don't know that I would have a preference. We haven't looked at, what could we have done differently, which is why we would say the first thing we do is we'll put in a commission. What's happened in the country, we have to come to where do we want to go. If we continue going back and say we could have, should have, I don't think we would solve anything.
I agree.
Yeah.
Therefore, us being at this place as a country, as an economy, what then would be your way forward as the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe, actually in as far as where land is concerned?
Oh, we need to be productive, which is why I said we would launch a commission that one investigates that process that took place and say, how do we create peace and reconciliation? Because we need to be productive as a country. And then we do a land audit immediately and find out, is this land being produced? There are people that took advantage of that situation that were in places of power that now own multiple farms that lease that farm to white farmers. That's an issue, whether they're leasing it back or they're not using it. And there's some people who have taken land that's not even being used at all. It's now a bush. So there's no production taking place. We would need to conduct an audit of the land to ensure that the country starts to become productive again. But the commission and that audit would need to work hand in hand to make sure that we have a balanced opportunity for people in this country to succeed. And the people that say, hey, I have expertise, I have the mechanisms or abilities to produce and use this land properly, that they have the ability to do that. And if there's land that can be purchased, the people can purchase land legally and properly, and that we put financial mechanisms for the agricultural sector to succeed, whether we're doing it in wildlife, tourism, however that land is designed and is put together. We have to go through a land audit as a nation and see where we have some gaps and opportunities.
Now, the government of Zimbabwe is currently in some form of re-engagement process and agenda with the Commonwealth. The goal there, of course, being to be a part of that particular club. Where does the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe stand where that particular stance is concerned?
You know, the Commonwealth all these organizations are there. You know, there's a BRICS organization. There are many others that are there. The Commonwealth is interesting historically for us as Zimbabwean. So if the government, I'm not sure because I'm not inside that conversation in government to understand what that looks like, but I know that there may be some requirements that the government would have to, some concessions they might have to adhere to that may be required to get in the Commonwealth. I would just ask and make sure that the interest of joining the Commonwealth, does it represent the interest of the people of Zimbabwe? And that's where we come first. Does it help the country progress? Does it help the Zimbabweans become more prosperous, whether it's domestically or internationally? So as long as we're adhering to that method and saying that we're going into this agreement, into this arrangement, because it serves the people of Zimbabwe first, then I don't see a problem with that, whether it's the Commonwealth or any other trade organization that would help the country move forward, and which is what I was bringing before. That engagement, if it's what's going to bring Zimbabwe close to global industrialization and it allows the country to grow, then I think it's fantastic.
Right. A topical issue around the globe is that of climate change and the impact that it is having on humanity, as well as the steps that need to be taken to try and mitigate the crisis that we actually have as a globe at hand. The question is, what is the plan from the perspective of the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe?
Yeah, climate change is a big one, and I don't know that would have time, but hopefully I can answer very quickly on that question. Right now as we're speaking, we see the cyclone that's coming towards the Mozambican border. I think I saw about 2 o'clock this morning, Beira had started flooding already. The city of Beira in Mozambique has been flooding. And my heart and prayers go out to the people of Mozambique and the other islands that have been affected, Madagascar and so forth. Climate change is a real thing. We're seeing a global shift. Places that are experiencing, whether it's global warming, we're seeing the climate change, we're seeing the weather and change very quickly. It affects us, of course, as Zimbabweans, particularly in the agricultural sector. I think we see an increase in veld fires in some of our regions. We're seeing that in certain areas. We're seeing heavy rains that are destroying crop. What we need to have is stimulus packages and make sure that we have money set aside and assets set aside to be able to come in, whether it's preventative measures in place for our people of the country, or it's the responsive networks that are there for our people. We saw that fail in the Chimanimani incident, where there was no help that went to the people there. I believe some of them might still be living in tents today, which is very unfortunate, as some people took $40,000 and some have received cars from the government. And now we've got a second one headed for our country. So the preventative side is preventive measures on one side is critical. How do we prevent veld fires, and do we have equipment and expertise in place that if a veld fire started, it doesn't go and destroy crops? The second one is, are we looking at technology that looks at such things as green indoor growing facilities that allow us to bypass some of the climate change issues that exist today? I recently spoke at a food summit in the United States right before a press conference in December. And one of the things we talked about was food insecurity. And more than just food insecurity was also quality of food, what were considered food deserts. And there's enough technology in place that we can implement in this country that allows us to sustain some of the things that are happening in climate change. We can't really control Mother Nature, but we can certainly be prepared for what she might deliver and also be responsive to what might take place when she does come with with a little bit of pain, and we experience that for our people. Right now, I don't think we have that. We don't have helicopters or that can or planes that can help with fault fires and putting those out. And then we also don't have responsive units that if the country got hit, that immediately there's deployment and making sure that people are safe and rescued. But that would be my response.
Right. Now, out of interest, suppose you attain the 74% that you're garnering for. How many ministers would your cabinet have? And would they have deputy ministers?
We would have ministers, yes, and we would, deputy ministers, yeah. It's, you're asking. How
many?
So you're asking me specific numbers, which I can't give you that one. We're going to go through Congress. We've got our process that the Constitution requires us to follow, and we will follow that. And I think if we have a follow-up interview after that.
Wouldn't you have perhaps an idea that you'd perhaps propose to the team?
We do, but I think it would be careless for me to answer that, because that number then would become the measuring point or some sort of baseline, which is why I think, if I'm being smart in the responses, is saying let's have the conversation after our party goes to Congress, and then we go through that procedure. If I was to answer and tell you that there's a specific number and then we don't follow that number, I would just be setting myself up for, a dialogue that would not really be of much depth.
Robert Chapman, the presidential candidate for the Democratic Union of Zimbabwe. Well, that's a wrap from The Chase and the team behind the scenes. To, of course, share with us your thoughts on our various social media handles at ZTN Prime, as well as at Zimpaper's TV network, across the different social media handles that we have. I'm Ibn Mabunda. Let them do what they do, where they do what they do, and we do what we do, women business. Good evening.